Hello, everybody. This is Morgan, and we are back here to do another lab walkthrough. For this lab slash exercise slash challenge, you had to compare using RDS and to DynamoDB. So this one had you create an RDS instance and then create a read replica for that Amazon RDS instance. And then it had you create a DynamoDB table and then spin up a DynamoDB accelerator cluster and then compare the results. So whenever we say compare the results, this one's a little bit more conceptual, meaning, think about how your applications would use these caches. Think about the different types of configurations you can apply to these different caches, things like that. So this one's a little bit more about you maybe diving into the AWS documentation to support you while you created these, and also just observing, what the creation process is like, the different types of configurations you can make, things like that. All right, so to start, let's first navigate to Amazon RDS and launch an RDS instance. All right, so we are here on the Amazon RDS dashboard. So I'm first going to click Create Database. And then from here, we will need to provide the different configurations. I'm going to select Standard Create, and then I'm going to select MySQL. And then down below, I'm going to leave the version, and then I'm going to actually select free tier for this one, just because we aren't going to actually be using this database. We're simply spinning it up so that way we can, figure out how we would work with this service. So I'm going to select free tier. And then we can give this a identifier. I'm going to name this lab3-RDS. And then I'm going to give this a password, and this would be so that you could connect to this instance. So though it's not a part of this lab, if you wanted to, you totally could download a SQL client and connect to this instance using the username and password. So keep that in mind as well. And then I'm going to scroll down here and leave everything else the same. And then for the VPC, I'm going to select just the default VPC. And I will also leave the default subnet as well. And then scroll down and click Create Database. All right, now this is going to take a few minutes to create. So while this is creating, I'm going to go ahead and create the DynamoDB table as well. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to DynamoDB, and then we'll come back and check on this in a few minutes. And I'm going to go ahead and click Create Table, and we'll give this a name here. It just has to be a unique name for this region. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this lab3 test, and then give this a partition key of ID, and then I will click Create Table. All right, now your DynamoDB table should create much faster than your RDS instance. So the RDS DB instance is booting up on, it's essentially like an EC2 based type thing. That's your DB instance. So it has to go through the boot sequence and all that sorts of good stuff. Whereas DynamoDB is serverless. And so you can see here that our table's already ready to go. So that's looking good. Now, the next thing we need to do is start to use DynamoDB Accelerator. So if you look over on the left-hand side, we have this navigation section called DAX. That's DynamoDB Accelerator. I'm going to go ahead and click on Clusters and then Create Cluster. And from here, I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call it Lab3 Cluster. And then we can leave the node type to be selected DAX R5 large. So you can see we can select different node types. So this would depend on what type of performance you need, how much memory you need, how much CPU you need, things like that. So if you need really, really low latency or low throughput, you might select the T-type family. It just kind of depends on what you need, on what type of family you would choose. So I would definitely recommend looking at the documentation about those families if you're planning to use DynamoDB. And then we can leave the number of nodes to be 3 here as well. And you can scale the nodes up or down later fairly easily. We'll go ahead and click Next. Next, we have to select what VPC we want to use. We're going to go ahead and create a new subnet for this. So we'll create a subnet group. I'm going to call this subnet 1. And then for your VPC ID, I'm going to go ahead and just select the default VPC again. And then for your subnet, you could select a specific subnet. So I'm going to select one subnet for this. You could select many subnets and for you to have your cluster kind of spread across those subnets. And then I'm going to also leave the default security group for access for this, and then just click next. And now we can choose a role, AWS service role for DAX. So this is choosing an existing role. I'm going to just select the first one here, and now we will click next. And from here, you can change all sorts of different things about this if you would like to. Like you could edit your parameter groups, which are things like, like how long do you want an item to stay in the cache, things like that. And you can also specify a maintenance window if you would like. And this is when all of your software upgrades and patches would be applied to your nodes. So you can control all of that here as well. I'm just going to go ahead and leave the defaults and then click next and then click create cluster. And this will take some time to create this cluster. So unlike a DynamoDB table, this is going to take a few minutes to spin up. So while this is working, let's go ahead and go back to RDS. And now that we're back in RDS, let's click on DB instances. And then we can see here that we are not totally ready here. This will say up and running whenever we're ready. So let's pause here and then we'll come back when this is done. All right, this instance is now available. So what I'm going to do now is click Actions and then click Create Read Replica. And this will create our read replica. And so again, the read replica is something that you would use when you have read heavy workloads. So this would help offload any requests to that backend database if needed to the read replica. So we'll go ahead and give this an identifier. I'm going to call this lab3 read replica. And then I'm going to leave the rest of the defaults. And then I will scroll down and click Create Read Replica. All right, and now we can see we have this read replica, and this is also creating. So we'll give this a few minutes here to spin up, and then we will discuss the differences between these two. So just hang tight, and we'll be right back. All right, so we are back, and you can see that our read replica is now available. So if I click on this read replica, you can view the different information about this. You can see that we currently have 0 connections, but again, if you wanted to, you could create an application that points to this read replica and reads the data from this. So again, this is a cache, so you would be pointing just your read requests to this endpoint here. And then you can also go and look at the different types of information here, like monitoring, the logs and the events, different configurations that you can apply, things like that. And so now finally, let's go back to DynamoDB and check on our cluster. So we have our lab3 cluster, and you can see that this one has an endpoint as well. So let me pull some documentation onto the screen here. Whenever you're thinking about the differences between these two caches, and just not even the differences comparing them, but just kind of understanding how they work. So your application, let's say you have an application running on an EC2 instance, and then you have a DynamoDB accelerator cluster, and then your DynamoDB table. Your DAX cluster kind of sits in between. So all of your read requests, your write requests, all of your requests would go to this cluster. And then DynamoDB accelerator handles the communication between the cluster and the actual table. And so in your application, all you would have to do is essentially flip out your client for DynamoDB, put in place the DynamoDB accelerator client. So that's what we're looking at here. Whereas if we instead look at the read replicas, this is set up a little bit differently. So here you have your application servers and you have your primary database, and then you have a second read replica. So notice how your application servers are reading and writing to your primary database, right? So we're going to this specific database, and then maybe you have some really read-heavy requests like reporting or aggregating data or doing really lengthy queries, things like that, that kind of eat up the CPU on your regular instance. You would have those going to the read-only read replica, right? So these are kind of a different architecture. If I just kind of go like this, you can see a little bit what I'm referring to. So we have, in this particular example, we have, reading and writing to the primary, and then the read only goes to the read replica. So you kind of have to know where to direct your requests. Whereas with DynamoDB Accelerator, let me drag this off the screen, you have your application will talk to the cluster, and then all the communication handles behind the scenes there. DynamoDB Accelerator kind of handles that for you. All right, so then the last thing you have to do here for this lab is delete all of the resources that you created. So that's deleting your DynamoDB Accelerator cluster, deleting the table, deleting the read replica, and deleting the DB instance. All right, so that is it for now. Thank you, and catch you next time.